All right, well, thank you all for joining us for our next edition of our Antiochian Men Bible Study. And it was great for those of you who could join us in person last time at the Parish Life Conference. We're back to our regular Zoom format. So without further ado, Father Stephen, I'll give the floor to you.
It's our regularly scheduled format. Unfortunately, I didn't just arrive 24 hours late on a plane.
Well, that added a lot of drama when
Yeah.
we had a Bible study on the schedule and then we had to move it. But thanks for being flexible, Father.
It all turned out. Yeah, we'll go ahead. Get started. When we get started here in a moment, we're going to be starting at the beginning of Exodus chapter 14. So first, let me go ahead and I'll open with prayer. O Heavenly King, the comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. So last time, insofar as I remember it, it's a little bit of a blur, but we went through chapter 13, and so we've been in kind of what to call it. Intermission isn't the right word. So we were sort of following the action of Exodus, right? We went through the 10 plagues on Egypt, through which God is, through Moses, delivering the people of Israel out of Egypt. We came up to the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn, and then sort of the forward momentum of the narrative kind of paused. And so the last couple Bible studies, we've kind of been in that narrative pause, because, of course, narratively, that night, the night of the death of the firstborn, is also the night in which the people of Israel are leaving Egypt. But there was a pause in order to lay out a number of, frankly, liturgical issues, because we are in Exodus, of course, in the Torah. We're so used to thinking in terms of the word law that when we think of, we make this distinction between the Torah as the first 5 books of the Bible and the law or the commandments as sort of this later thing that comes in the later part of it. But of course, in terms of the way the scriptures talk about it, they just use one word. And that one word is to cover the first 5 books and all of their content. So they aren't, as we've seen, neatly divided into, okay, here's narrative, here's story, and then now here's commandments, and here's sort of other kinds of teaching. These are interspersed, and often the narratives are, the story that the narratives are telling is part and parcel, is exhibiting, is elucidating what is going to be elsewhere found in the form of commandments, and vice versa. And the commandments we see are sort of giving applications of narrative portions. And that latter category is really what we've been reading, because surrounding that first Passover, that event on that night of the death of the firstborn, of the marking of the doorposts with the blood of the lambs that were eaten by the families, to mark those people out as Israelites. That event, what we've seen during this pause, is the way in which that event was to be liturgically participated in and applied to the people in succeeding generations and future generations. So one of the reasons, going back to when we first started the life of Moses, why I think that it's such a unnecessary distraction to sit and argue about exactly when the Exodus happened, is that part of the point the Torah is making is that every time the Passover was celebrated, it was tonight, right? It was, this is, why is this night different than all other nights? Because through eating the Passover together as a family, they were coming to participate in that night. They were being delivered from Egypt. This wasn't just a historical event that happened on one day in history. It did, but that date becomes much less relevant when you realize that that's a day that's participated in ritually and liturgically later on. So you could say the same, and there are some people who like to argue about it, like what day of the week exactly Jesus was crucified on and all of these things. But the same is true for us, right, as Orthodox Christians. In Holy Week, over and over again in our hymns, it's today, right? This day, this is the day, right? This is the day of resurrection. It's not just about a day that happened a long time ago. This is now because we're participating in it, right, ritually and liturgically. And so that work was kind of done for us, right, here in the text very explicitly. God says, in fact, in terms of eating the Passover, excuse me, God says, here's how you are to keep this in future generations before it happens, right? And we talked about how that's parallel to the way that Christ instituted the Eucharist and the participation in his broken body and shed blood before his body was broken and his blood was shed. And then last time we talked about, there was some more about Passover, but also the element of the dedication of the firstborn to God, which again was a way in which going forward, the people participated in the reality of this deliverance from Egypt that happened in Exodus. And so I'm sure there are folks who would have either made quick work or even skipped parts of the last couple chapters as they worked through Exodus with people to just kind of continue the story. Okay, yeah. So there's this. And then now on to our story. What's happening to the Israelites? What's happening with Pharaoh and the Egyptians, right? Just follow the through line of the narrative. But these texts are telling us the importance of this narrative, right? Because just like in St. John makes this explicit in his gospel, right? He says, you're going to write down everything Jesus said and did, right? There's not enough books in the world to contain it. These things are written so that you would believe Jesus is the Christ, Jesus is the Messiah, right? And being faithful, you would have life in his name. So there's a purpose for which certain events and not others are narrated in a certain way in the biblical text. And it's not just to tell us this happened, and it's not just to give us a way to figure out exactly when that happened. It's to describe the event in a way that describes its significance, and then to its significance specifically to us, the later generation of readers. There are lots of events not recorded in the Bible that were very significant for the people who lived through them. But these are significant going forward. These are significant to every generation of God's followers, right? So now, that said, as we pick up in chapter 14, even at the end of chapter 13 last time, we kind of we're getting back to narrative, because it talked about them gathering up the bones of Joseph and the pillar of cloud, pillar of fire. We talked about the presence of God and the Holy Spirit going before them. But now, of course, we are coming up in chapter 14 to Israel crossing the Red Sea, which I think we talked about a little bit last time, but we'll go over again this time because now we're in sort of the meat of the story. So unless anybody has any questions or comments or brief pro wrestling anecdotes, we'll go ahead and pick up at the beginning of Exodus chapter 14 with verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, that they turn and camp at the village between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon. You shall camp before them by the sea." So as they're leaving Egypt, we are told they come to the sea, right? And here, the way it is in the Greek that's being translated in the Orthodox Study Bible, Old Testament, it's a little vague as to what sea, right? So like if you were just going by this, one could wonder, okay, is this the Mediterranean Sea? Is this the right? What exact sea is this? We're going to see, pun not intended, that it's the Greek is going to explicitly call it the Red Sea. I think like I said, I think we talked about this a little last time, but it's worth reviewing. Famously, the Hebrew there has Yam Suf, which means the Reed Sea or the Sea of Reeds. And so a lot of time and effort by a lot of those same folks who are really worried about exactly what year the Exodus happened and exactly which Pharaoh was Pharaoh at the time, also get really excited, and good for them if this is their thing, right? But it's not mine, about where exactly this crossing we're about to read about took place. It's not that I don't have, I have an answer for that. It's just not a hill I would die on or care to spend a lot of time arguing about. But it seems to me that we have to take the Greek identification seriously. Excuse me. And I think what's going on, Greek identification being that this is the Red Sea in some sense. And I think what's going on with Yam Suf in the Hebrew is a play on words, because the phrase for Red Sea and Reed Sea are very close. And so I think there's something very deliberate going on. This is actually fairly common in the Hebrew Bible. Hebrew words are made up of 3 consonants. That's called the triliteral root, is the fancy word for that. And then those 3 consonants are vocalized in different ways, meaning different vowel sounds are supplied between and around them in order to reflect different grammar. But sort of the root of the word is 3 letters. And as you can imagine, with a 22-letter alphabet and all your words being made up of 3 letters, there are many cases in which you have more than one word that has the same 3 letters, right? They may be pronounced differently, what have you, but it's the same 3 letters on paper, right? And this would be comparable to, like in English, the word green can refer to a color. It can refer to part of a golf course. It can refer to being jealous. It can refer to money. like currency. It can refer to certain smokable products. It can refer to being a neophyte, being new at something. It's the same word, it's the same letters, right? But you know what it means based on context, right? And so if you're someone who's a native English speaker and you know that the word has all of these meanings, you can play with that, right? You could do sort of puns, right? You can sort of do plays on words. You can imply more than one meaning of the word when you use it. Same thing happens a lot in Hebrew. So I think the ambiguity between Sea of Reeds and the Red Sea is one of these things that is deliberate, right? So, and part of that is because when you're talking about the Red Sea obviously is a very material, physical place, right? You could go take a photo of the Red Sea. You could go take a video camera of it. And find it on a map, find it on a globe really easily. And the Reed Sea, although there are some folks out there who want to identify the Sea of Reeds or the Reed Sea with some marsh or swamp area around Egypt, in reality, when you read Egyptian literature, the Reed Sea, the Sea of Reeds, is actually a place in spiritual geography. It's literally a place in the underworld. It is a place in the realm of the dead. So when you look at starting all the way back in the Old Kingdom, so from well before the time, the time when anybody dates the Exodus, well before that, you have stories in Egypt describing the underworld that refer to the Sea of Reeds, and the goal for our departed soul, what Egyptians called the Ka, the essence of the person, the heart of the person, right? They would have certain, sometimes magical things, sometimes prayers to particular gods and goddesses that they believed would enable the soul to cross safely across the Sea of Reeds and make it to the other side. And that was sort of, in the ancient Near East, there isn't really a heaven, right? There's a place where the gods live. Humans don't really go there unless they get turned into gods. And that's relatively rare. People get thrown out more than they get let in. But there are better and worse parts of the underworld. There are more and less horrific parts of the underworld in the ancient Near East. And the souls that make it across the Sea of Reeds are the ones that go to the better kind of underworld existence. Whereas the ones who would be the damned, the ones who don't make it, who get tangled in the reeds, who get dragged down in the Sea of Reeds, they're referred to as the drowned ones. That's a way of referring to the condemned or the damned in these Egyptian stories. The ones who drown and don't make it across the Sea of Reeds. So I don't think it's spoiling anything. I think we kind of know where the story's going, everybody here probably. To see how, if your question is, if I had a video camera and I jumped in a time machine and I figured out the correct date, what would I see in my through my video camera lens, Israel doing? Right. Then the answer to that question seems to be crossing part of the Red Sea. When we're talking about the level of spiritual experience, which is not less real. And by spiritual experience, I don't mean emotional experience, right? We tend to treat spiritual as fake or emotional or intellectual or that kind of thing. What spiritual really means is pertaining to the spiritual world, the world of angels, demons, right? Which of course is real and is just as real. The invisible creation, we believe, and we proclaim every time we say the Nicene Creed, is just as real as the visible creation, right? So in terms of the invisible creation, and the experience of the people, the real concrete experience of the people who participated in what we're about to read, they were crossing over through the underworld. They were brought through death by God and to new life on the other side. They were brought across the Sea of Reeds. Right? So, short version, if the question is, are we talking about the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds? The answer is yes. Because this part of the Red Sea is the Sea of Reeds at this point when it is crossed by the Israelites. And in terms of which part of the Red Sea, one of the reasons the geography kind of doesn't work out, this is one of the reasons why people became dissatisfied with the idea that it was the Red Sea proper, like what we call the Red Sea today. Satellite imagery has revealed that there were actually a system of locks connected to the Red Sea, what we would call locks, right? Connected to the Red Sea at this point in Egyptian history that were used as sort of an eastern borderline by Egypt. And so in terms of which part of the Red Sea, right, they're connected to the Red Sea, it's Red Sea water. That's likely the part that now Israel is approaching. Right? And in these markers, we're given these markers, right, that they're to turn and camp at the village that's between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon. Okay, so Migdol means tower. So but it's likely the name of a particular city there. There are a number of cities with that in the name, but there's likely a particular city that had a tower that's there. So this is very much between that and the sea, these are very much reference points in terms of physical geography, right, of where they're to go and camp, right, by the sea. But then that second marker where it says opposite Baal Zephon, Baal, that's Baal, right, like the pagan god Baal. And Zephon is the compass direction north. And Mount Zephon, the mountain of the north, is the mountain where Baal lived. That was like the Baal equivalent of Mount Olympus. It's in what's now Lebanon, southern Lebanon. And so this does not seem, when God says opposite Baal of the north or Baal of Mount Zephon, that's not like a physical geography indicator. That's a spiritual indicator, right? Baal's palace in the north, Baal, who's god of the underworld, right? So we can see even in this kind of geographic reference here, it's not purely a geographic reference. There's sort of two layers to it, of physical geography and of spiritual geography sort of layered on top of each other, right? Like if you're old enough to remember overhead projectors, like you take transparencies in an overhead projector and put one over the other, right? And overlap them. You have this overlapping geography. And this mountain of the north part, by the way, is why the compass direction north is associated in the scriptures with the presence of evil. That's where Baal is. That's where the forces of evil are. That's where invasions come from when you're reading the prophets. The armies come from the north. When they're speaking about apocalyptic wars. That's also why in Matins, we read the resurrection gospel facing north, because we're proclaiming the resurrection of Christ to the defeated demonic powers in the north. So the priest stands on the south side of the altar facing north when he reads the Matins Gospel. But so all that is to say, and like I said, I think some of that is recap from last time, but this story is not the way the story is presented, even from here at the very beginning. We're being told this is a cosmic event. This isn't just this sort of material event of some people who are slaves in Egypt are now going to get to go free, which is great for them, right? But right, but that this is an event of greater cosmic import. That there are things happening in the visible creation and things happening at the same time in the invisible creation. And this is a point where they're overlapping. So they're told to make camp there. Verse 3, for Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the desert has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them. And I will be glorified in Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know I am the Lord. So they did. That so they did is so they camped there. Right. Now, notice that what God says here, he doesn't just say, hey, camp here because I happen to know Pharaoh's on his way. It's not just that he's knowing. There's this language once again, and we talked about this before. I won't go back through all of this again. But we've talked before about this language of Pharaoh hardening his heart and Pharaoh's heart being hardened. And we know that Pharaoh deciding to now come after the Israelites after he had finally decided to let them go. Again, I don't think it's real spoilers that we know this is about to end in disaster for Pharaoh and his army. But notice here, importantly, why God says he's doing it. He says he's going to do this. The reason this is playing out, the reason this is all playing out with Egypt in this way is so that the Egyptians may know that he is the Lord. And remember what's getting translated here. What it literally says is in the Hebrew is, so the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. Right. So a couple things there. First, it's been a while probably since we mentioned this, but the name, one of the names of God, obviously a very prominent name of God in the Old Testament, is Yahweh. This is the third masculine singular for fancy pants Hebrew people. It's in the Hifil, which means it has sort of a causative sense. So it's literally, that name literally means he who causes to be. The one who causes things to be that before were not. Right. So this has to do with creation. Right. This has to do, and creation in the Old Testament is not just something that happened once a long time ago, and now everything just sort of ticks along. Creation is continual, right? Creation is something God does new every morning. That creation is not just that initial making of things out of nothing, but it is the ongoing process of God preserving things and bringing into being every new thing and every new person that comes into being. So it's not that Adam and Eve were created by God and then everyone else was a result of natural processes. From the perspective of the Old Testament, each human person is created by God in his or her mother's womb. So creation is this ongoing thing. And so it's not just saying they will know that I am the Lord makes it just sound like they'll know I'm the boss, right? And not Pharaoh. Well, that's included. But the core idea is that they will know he is the one who gives life, who creates, who brought them into the world, right? And notice he says he's doing this so the Egyptians will know. He's not doing this to make a further display of his power to the Israelites, whose God he is, but to display who he is to the Egyptians. So this is very important. I know I've mentioned it before, but it is so important because people don't, we've had some very different cross currents in the United States, in the theology of some of our Protestant friends, that has failed to recognize that here from the very beginning of the existence of Israel as a nation, God is concerned about the other nations too. Right? He's not the God of Israel at the exclusion of everyone else. Right? As we saw when we were going through the life of Abraham, right? The idea was that all the nations would be blessed through Abraham. Right? The purpose of God saving Israel is through Israel, he's planning to save all the nations. Right? And so here, even as Israel is nascent, right, and is being saved from and delivered from Egypt, the Egyptians are the bad guys so far in our story, right? But God is doing this the way he's doing it because he also wants the bad guys to come to know who he is. He also wants the Egyptians to come to know who he is. And that paints what's going to happen here in a very different light, I think. Verse 5, now it was told the king of the Egyptians that the people had fled. And the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people, and they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? Now you may be like, well, he forgot pretty quickly. I think you did that because all these horrible things were happening, like the death of your son, culminating in the death of your son. And you didn't want more horrible things to continue to happen to Egypt. It's very hard for Pharaoh to take an L, right? It's very hard. Pharaoh's never accepted losses. This is one of the things when you study ancient Egypt and you study ancient Egyptian inscriptions, you learn this very quickly. No pharaoh ever lost a battle, according to pharaohs. According to Egyptian records, they never lost a battle. So you read these records where Egypt has certain territory, they go into battle with someone else. After the battle, that territory belongs to the other country, not to Egypt anymore. Egypt loses a huge number of troops and then declares victory in all their inscriptions. They make these inscriptions about how glorious their victory was, where they lost this territory and all these people, right? And that seems just bizarre doublespeak to us, right? But that's how it worked in Egypt, right? And this is part and parcel of how the Egyptians saw themselves. The Egyptian word for Egyptian just means human. They don't have a word for like humans and then a separate word for humans who happen to be Egyptians. Egyptians are humans. Everybody else is in this other category, right? That's sort of subhuman. Pharaoh is a god, right? So like they can't lose, right? This is part of some celestial plan. This is the playing out of some, divine mystery. It might look to you like we just got destroyed in battle, but right? there's more at foot here, right? That you don't understand. And so again, the move is to just celebrate, right? To just celebrate. Another Egyptian move is there are a few periods in history where Egypt was conquered by foreigners and they set up a foreign dynasty. over Egypt. And when that happens, again, the Egyptians didn't lose and get conquered, right? The glorious new king of Egypt revealed himself through victory. And you're like, well, that's okay, right? Like, and we just ignore the previous pharaoh, the previous dynasty that he killed off. We ignore the fact that he's not technically Egyptian, et cetera, et cetera. And this happened right up to Alexander and including Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, they just proclaimed as the new pharaoh after he won. Right? They just said, behold, the pharaoh of Egypt, who has revealed himself by conquering Egypt, by being victorious in battle. So they had ways of even co-opting that kind of loss. And I say all that for two reasons. One, you have to understand that with Pharaoh and the Egyptians here, right? It's not possible. The idea that they lost to these slaves somehow, or even to the god of a bunch of slaves, is not something they can process. It's not possible to them. This is impossible, right? And so surely we need to fix it. Surely if we go to fix it, we will be successful, right? Because the other outcome is simply off the table. This also explains why, and anybody who remotely has the credential to call themselves an Egyptologist knows better. But you will still hear people all the time on documentaries on cable, which I feel compelled to watch for sick masochistic reasons, when they talk about the Exodus, saying that, oh, well, there's no Egyptian records describing the Exodus, as if that's a surprise, right? Like, if we did ever find Egyptian records of it, they would just be declaring victory, right? Like, somehow, right? You're not going to find records of a defeat. And so Pharaoh, his advisors, right, are not able to process this. So they have to, right? They can either cease being who they are, cease being Pharaoh, cease being Egyptian, or they have to go after the Israelites. Verse 6, so he made ready his chariot and took his people with him. Also, he took 600 choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every one of them. Thus the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and his servants, and he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with a high hand. Okay. So this phrase, with a high hand, with a hand held high, that's a posture for taking an oath. So the idea is that this is a thing you're doing publicly. This is a thing you're not ashamed of. So it's making the point here, what that means is that the Israelites didn't sort of sneak off in the middle of the night. Excuse me. This wasn't a group of slaves who like ran away, slipped away when Egyptians weren't looking or something. They went out in full public view. They marched out. The idea here being, so Pharaoh and his army aren't going to have a big problem following them, right? They're not going to have to roam around trying to figure out where the Israelites went. They very publicly marched off into the desert. Pharaoh knows exactly where to go to follow them. Again, the hardening of the heart language we talked about just briefly. We talked about how that was, in a sense, saying this confirmation of who he is, right? God made him true to who he is. And as we were just talking about, he can't lose, right? He can't, it's not possible for him to process that and live with that and work through that. And so he gathers up his chariots. That's telling us a couple of things. Number one, so nobody in the ancient Near East really had a standing army. A standing army means an army that's just an army. So like the United States today has a standing army. We have military bases. There are uniformed military personnel there. They spend their days drilling, preparing to do training to do military things, right? That is a relatively recent thing in human history. For most of human history, other than like commanders, generals, kings, right? The very top elements of what would be considered an army, armies have been called up. They were basically drafted from farmers, from workers, artisans, whoever. And so most of them have been fairly poorly equipped, right? So your infantry, the vast swath of your infantry, and this is true well later. We talked about this, I know, back all the way back when we were doing the life of David. Even at that point in history, which is centuries after this, most people were using farm implements. Sometimes remolded. They're what were called sickle swords, that were basically sickles used for farming that had been sort of bent out a little bit into swords. This is where you get the language of beating swords into plowshares, right? Like you're turning them back, your weapons of war back into farming implements, because you're not going to make war anymore. But so armies would be called up at certain times and sent into battle. You would have certain people from certain social classes and that kind of thing, who would be more highly trained and better equipped. Even they would usually have other jobs when it wasn't the time for war. Sometimes they were government positions and that kind of thing. And then, of course, there were mercenaries in the ancient world who were, and we talked about this again with David. David was sort of the leader of a mercenary group, essentially, for a period of his life. Excuse me, when he was on the run from King Saul. Mercenaries were actually probably your most highly trained and best equipped people in the ancient world, because they just traveled around fighting for money and living off of that money during when people weren't making war, and taking other odd jobs. They would do things like what we would now call bounty hunting, which usually in the ancient world was finding criminals and killing them, and usually bringing a body part back as proof that you had done it. So when we read here that Pharaoh is getting together his chariot troops, which would also include his archers, this is not Pharaoh calls a bunch of the farmers together, right, with torches and sickles and pitchforks and stuff to go after the Israelites. This is, he brings out his top forces to go and take out this group of escaped slaves. Egyptian chariots, when we think of chariots, we may think of like Ben-Hur, we think of like Roman chariots, which are much bigger. Egyptian chariots at this time in history were relatively small. They had very thin wheels, and were very light. They would be pulled by one horse, and they were mostly used either by officers just for mobility, right, to keep them from getting pinned down and killed by the enemy, your officers and commanders, and then also by your archers. They could circle a battlefield and the archers could fire from the chariot. But he's bringing out sort of the best of his troops and equipment in his army to go after these escaped slaves, not just an angry mob. So the Israelites are outnumbered, outgunned, right, outmanned, and are fixing to be overpowered, and they've got the Egyptians coming from one direction and they've got the sea in the opposite direction right now. So things are looking bad, right, at this point. Verse 9, so the Egyptians pursued them, all the cavalry and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them camping by the village opposite Baal-Zephon. Now when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the desert? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it is better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Right. So you remember when Moses and Aaron first returned and first went to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Pharaoh made a fairly canny move of punishing the Israelites for it in their work, making their work more difficult, more exhausting, more grueling, and making it very clear that Moses and Aaron were why, right, to try to put a wedge between them and the people. And we saw how the Israelites, the elders of Israel, several times sort of told Moses and Aaron to knock it off in the face of what Pharaoh was doing. Of course, when the Egyptians started giving them their belongings and gold and treasures and things and telling them to go, the Israelites were all fine to go, right? But now that things start looking bad, immediately it's, weren't there enough graves in Egypt? You had to bring us out here to get buried, right? Why'd you do this? And this is setting a tone, right? And through the rest of the life of Moses, as we read it, this is going to be an ongoing theme. We're going to see over and over and over again Moses's love of the people and his representing them to God and interceding with God on their behalf, and them mostly hating him in response, right? Them mostly rejecting him in response, right? There is still among people an argument. There are people who will say, looking at the New Testament, they'll say, well, if Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, why did most of the Jewish people reject him? Even though over and over Christ says in the Gospels, right, like, which of the prophets did you not persecute, right? Like, starting with Moses, right? Most of the Israelites did not accept Moses, right? They grumbled against him here at the beginning. We're going to see all the way through. They're going to talk about murdering him at a couple points, on and on through the prophets who succeed him. I don't know why anyone who had read the Old Testament, or even here, just the Torah with Moses, would expect that when the Messiah came to Israel, he was just going to get accepted by everybody and everything was going to go swimmingly. It's very much, right, part of the pattern that the Bible establishes, starting with the Torah. Verse 13, then Moses said to the people, be of good courage, stand still and see the Lord's salvation, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you and you shall hold your peace. Right? That's just a great phrase. Those Egyptians you're looking at, the ones bearing down on us, those horses charging toward us, those Egyptians you see, you're not going to ever see them again. They're about to be gone. And notice it's not, we're going to fight and we're going to win because we believe in ourselves, and we're the plucky underdogs and we're going to maintain our peace, right? God is going to fight for us, right? God is going to save us. He is going to go to battle for us. Verse 15, and then the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. Now lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and let the children of Israel go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. I indeed will harden Pharaoh's heart and all the Egyptians, and they will go in after them. So I will be glorified in Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots, and his horses. Then the Egyptians will know I am the Lord, when I am glorified upon Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horses. So we aren't told, right? Because it starts with God saying to Moses, why are you crying out to me? right? So Moses clearly said this to the people and then went and talked to God and said, hey, God, what are we going to do about these Egyptians, right? And God said, why are you worried, right? Moses sort of reassured the people, but this is, why are you worried, essentially, right? Spread out your rod, split the sea, walk the people forward, right, through it. And again, he says he's going to destroy Pharaoh and his powerful army, so that the Egyptians will know who he is. Verse 19, now the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud also went from before them and stood behind them. Okay. So this, and I'm definitely not going to go all the way down this rabbit hole again tonight, but you could go back and listen to when we were going through the life of Abraham, and we talked about the 3 visitors to Abraham and his hospitality, about the Trinity in the Old Testament. And we're going to see more about this angel. This angel here gets referenced. We're going to learn a little more about him in a couple chapters here. So when we get to him in a couple chapters, I will go more down this rabbit hole than I am tonight. But you have God who is talking to Moses, and then you have the pillar of cloud that we talked about being the presence of God, and an angel of God, right? The angel of the Lord, who is leading the people, right? And while God is talking to Moses, the angel of the Lord and the cloud that had been ahead of them circle around behind them. So now there's the sea, there's the people of Israel, right? And so if this is the people of Israel, the Egyptians are coming this way. And so now the pillar of cloud, the presence of God, and the angel of the Lord take up this position between the Egyptians and the people, right? Between them and Pharaoh. So when Christ is baptized in the Jordan River and the Holy Trinity is made manifest there by the waters, that's not the first time the Holy Trinity was manifest by the waters. And as I said, when we get to the part that talks more about this particular angel of the Lord, we'll talk more about that. Verse 20, so it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and the night passed, but there was such darkness and blackness that they did not come near one another all that night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord carried back the sea by a strong south wind all that night and made the sea dry ground. Thus the waters were divided. So sometimes the timetable, it's cool and dramatic in 10 Commandments and Prince of Egypt that Moses stretches out his arm and then just all of a sudden, boom, right? There's this big divide. And, in Prince of Egypt, you've got the whales swimming around and stuff. But the way it's actually depicted is, right, Pharaoh's coming up on them at sunset. The cloud and the angel go to keep them away, right, to block the Egyptians from coming after Israel over the course of the night. And over the course of the night, this wind sent by God not only separates the sea in front of them, but dries out the ground at the bottom, so that when the dawn comes, right, and the light comes, they can see that it is standing there separate at that point, and the ground has been dried. Verse 22, so the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Then the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen. Now it came to pass that in the morning watch, the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. Okay, so notice the perspective. Where does God look from? Right? When I talked about the pillar of fire and pillar of cloud at the end of the last Bible study being the Holy Spirit, being the presence of God, I connected that to the temple. But here we see it right here in the text, right? In the text of the Torah, God looks down from the pillar, right? Looks down like through the pillar, right? So this is sort of the manifestation of his presence, like the fire in the burning bush, from which he spoke to Moses. And he troubles the army of the Egyptians, meeting, verse 25, he bound the axles of their chariot wheels and caused them to proceed with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Okay. So they get out there, they're between the walls of water, and their wheels start getting stuck, right? Things get muddy. That would not be hard to do. The way those Egyptian chariots, as I mentioned, they had very thin wheels. They were made to be light and to move quickly. And that is not ideal for the kind of terrain they would have been trying to cross. So they start getting stuck, they start getting mired, they start breaking ranks. And, you know, they're between walls of water, right? And so it's clear to the Egyptian soldiers, if not yet to Pharaoh himself, that, right, Yahweh, the God of Israel, right, is the one who's actually fighting against them. And when it was, hey, we're a well-equipped military men with military experience, we're going to go and kill a bunch of runaway slaves in the desert, that was one thing. When it's, let's fight a God who's capable of splitting the sea, that's a different ask, right? And so they decide to retreat, right? As we're going to see, it's a little too late, but they decide to turn back, at least some of the Egyptian forces. Verse 26, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots and the riders. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were trying to flee. But the Lord shook off the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Okay. So he stretches out his hand over the sea again. The sea closes, returns to its original depth, and the Egyptian army is trapped and drowned within it. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all of Pharaoh's army that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained, but the children of Israel walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea. The waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the Lord's mighty hand and the things he did to the Egyptians. Therefore the people feared the Lord and believed God and his servant Moses. So first it says they drowned, and then it says they saw them on the seashore, right? This means they're bloated bodies, right? That they drowned, and then the bodies washed up, right, on the shore of the sea, right? So the sea that represents the going all the way back to Genesis 1, right? The waters, the sea that represent chaos, that represent death. God is not only fully in control of, but just as he was able to separate the dry land from the water in Genesis. Remember, Genesis is sort of the prologue to the rest of the Torah. He does it again now, right, to bring his people safely through Sea of Reeds, safely through death and the shadow of death into new life, through the Sea of Reeds. Whereas the Egyptians, those who trusted in Pharaoh and his army and the gods of Egypt, they end up being the drowned ones. They're the ones who don't make it. They're the ones who are ensnared by death, the forces of death and chaos. Remember, God said before the Passover happened that he was about to judge all the gods of Egypt, right? And so this is what he has now done. This is obviously an important element when it comes to our understanding of the death and resurrection of Christ. And this isn't just a weird allegorical thing, right? That's part of what I wanted to communicate tonight. There's a reason why Christ's death and resurrection happens at Passover. When we talk about Christ's death and resurrection in the West, it tends to be in terms of atonement and different theories of atonement. And I could talk to you all day about the Day of Atonement. That's fine. But Christ didn't die and rise again on the Day of Atonement. He died and he rose again at the Passover, right? And so all of the gospel writers, right? Christ himself, by doing that, right? Because of course he laid down his life and was able to take it up again. He chose when he was going to die and rise again. And then also the gospel writers helping us to see this, right, is to cause us to understand what's going on with Christ's death and resurrection in terms of the Passover. And we've already talked about parts of this, in terms of eating the Passover and the Eucharist. We talked about a little bit. There's obviously the level where what's happening at Passover is primarily manumission, the freeing of slaves. And so the idea of our being set free from slavery to sin and slavery to the evil spiritual powers, were the same kind of evil spiritual powers reflected in the gods of Egypt that had enslaved the Egyptians, and through the Egyptians had enslaved the Israelites. So there's our freedom from slavery to sin, which is an important element. But this is also obviously another important element, and it is of key importance in our liturgical celebration in the Rush service on Pascha, right? We're celebrating this new Exodus in the sense of a new crossing of the sea, right? This that we've just read, and the song that, based on the time it's looking like we're going to get to next time, the Song of the Sea in chapter 15. That's read, and the Song of the Sea is chanted on Holy Saturday morning, if you do the baptismal liturgy with all the Old Testament readings. And it's not just a metaphor of the Israelites are led out of Egypt. The souls of the saints of the Old Testament are led out of Hades and into paradise by Christ in the harrowing of Hades. That's there. But that's not just at that level of pattern, right? Because as we were saying when we began tonight, the experience that the people had and the experience that was participated in later at the celebration of the Passover was the experience of passing through the underworld, of passing through death to begin life anew, or being trapped and seized by death, as the Egyptians were, being caught and seized by death and held fast. Right? And so when we say that this is what Christ did in his death and resurrection, and that this is what we participate in our liturgical celebration of it, we're not just making a metaphor. We're referring to an actual experience, and an actual experience that we come to participate in. This is why, with all of the language St. Paul's always using about baptism, right? As many as you as were baptized into Christ have been baptized into his death, right? That we've been baptized with Christ, we've died with Christ, so we also live with him, that we go into the water and die, we come out of the water and rise again. And then what does he say in 1 Corinthians? He says that this generation was baptized into Moses, talking about this event, right? That's not just an analogy. He's saying in the same way that they experience the death of the slave that they were, and the birth of this new person, an Israelite, a new type of person, because this was a nation that had never existed before on the face of the earth, right? In the same way, the Christian who is baptized experiences the death of the old slave to sin that we were, and the coming into being of this new person, a Christian, a type of person that there never was on the earth before. That new beginning, right? And the place where that deal is going to be sealed, as we're going to see as we keep reading in the life of Moses, is going to be at the foot of Mount Sinai on the first Pentecost. And where that's sealed for us is going to be on our own participation in Pentecost when we receive the Holy Spirit. But we'll get to that later when we get to Pentecost. But so for the New Testament writers, whether we're talking about the gospel writers or St. Paul, it isn't that what happens in the Torah is just a quote unquote mere symbol or just an image or somehow flat, superficial. They really had this experience, right? But Christ takes what was the experience of this group of people, and then a few people going forward, and Christ fulfills it by making it a sort of cosmic reality, right? That it's not just the select group, but it's all people and for all time with these cosmic effects. So this is what Christ means when he says he's not interested in abolishing the Torah, but fulfilling it, meaning filling it full, filling it up to overflowing. Right? He's doing what it did, right? Doing what he did at this time, right, as recorded in the Torah, but doing it again on the cosmic scale, right? On the scale of the whole creation in this overflowing way. So I know that's big and maybe in some ways general and hard to wrap your mind around. Next time when we get into chapter 15, the Song of the Sea, which is the first of the biblical odes, when we talk about the biblical odes at Matins, it's also one of, if not the oldest parts of the Torah. By that I mean that's not been changed or edited. The Hebrew in Genesis 15 is very antiquated Hebrew. It's not the same kind of Hebrew. It's a more ancient form of Hebrew. It'd be like if you were reading through an edited together book, and you came to a chapter of it that read like Shakespeare or read like the King James Version Bible, right? And you'd say, oh, well, they must not have done as much editing to this part, right? They left this part sort of the way it was originally written, even though it's antiquated, kind of updated some of the language and some of the other parts, but not here. That's what we're going to see next chapter. And the imagery there in that hymn, it's going to appeal to a lot of imagery from Egyptian beliefs and stories and very early Israelite and Canaanite beliefs and stories. in order to come at the things we've been talking about tonight from a poetic and a kind of different symbolic angle, to try to convey these same kind of ideas in kind of a slightly different way. I think last time I promised that this time we'd get to Mantu. Sorry, but I guarantee you next Bible study, chapter 15, Mantu, will finally make his appearance and wave to all of us, which is a reference that will make sense when we talk about Mantu.
You could say it's man to be continued.
Nice.
Being a dad, you're allowed to make dad jokes like that.
Well, that's my one for the day. I only get one. All right. If anyone has any questions, feel free to either unmute and ask your question, or you can put it in the chat if you'd like. Any questions for Father Stephen?
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I actually have a question. When you were talking about earlier spiritual geography, Father, and you've made I'd heard you talk about this before, where in the Orthodox service, during Matins, when the gospel is read, it's read facing north. And I remember you talking about how that's representative of essentially announcing the defeat of evil directly at like the fallen demons and everything. I think you had also said something, and forgive me, I forget, but something about just before that, I think it's the prokimenon, and the purpose of that is almost like the trumpet ahead of the army, or I don't know how you worded it, but I don't know if you can maybe hook those two together, what the purpose of the prokimenon is before the gospel.
Right. Yeah. Well, so there's actually two prokimena there. There's one that's fixed and there's one that changes. Right. And the one that changes are almost all arise verses from the Psalms. And what I mean by arise verses is, in the Greek, they have the verb anesti in there. And sometimes you can tell and sometimes you can't, depending on the translation, right? So there's one of them, and they've updated some of the translations recently. There's one that for a long time they had as, O Lord, arouse thyself and come to our salvation. Where you can kind of get that arouse there is kind of the arise idea. The idea is rise up, O Lord, and come to our salvation. We sometimes say, oh, well, so people took the idea of Christ's resurrection and they went back into the Old Testament and just, oh, hey, look, here's a place where that word appears. Right? Like, that's so quick jump on it. It's actually the opposite. That word is used repeatedly in the Psalms and in the prophets to talk about the day when God is going to come to deliver his people, right? When God is going to come and defeat the powers of evil that are oppressing his people and deliver them. The idea of arising being right now, he is resting, he is enthroned, right? That he is going to rise up, like literally stand up. That's why anastasis, that's literally what it means. To refer to that day. And so in the New Testament, it's hard to tell if you don't read the Greek. But there's two different words. The word, when it just says Jesus rose from the dead, is not, they don't use anastasis. It's the verb egero, right? So I'll say he rose from the dead. When the New Testament talks about the resurrection, it talks about anastasis, right? And that's saying that Christ's resurrection, and that's connecting it to that event when God arises to judge the earth, right? Which we sing before the gospel on Holy Saturday, right? Arise, O God, and judge the earth. from Psalm 82 or 81, depending on the Greek or Hebrew numbering. And so it's connecting it to that event, right? To the resurrection. And that's actually the title, the harrowing of Hades icon. Its actual title is Anastasis. And so people get confused sometimes, and they say, well, wait, is it the resurrection when Christ left the tomb? It's like, yes, that's what Jesus rose from the dead. But the Anastasis, right, is being depicted when he's defeating the devil, right, and setting the people free, right? So yes, that's kind of the all of those passages that are lifted out for those prokimena are calls for God to go to war against his enemies, his spiritual enemies. So right, on our behalf.
So is it likened to kind of a battle cry, or like before the victory?
Or like blowing the bugle, right?
Yeah, like that's why I think I was thinking of like the trumpet that was going out ahead of the troops, almost kind of like announcing that it's coming, kind of, you know, like And I just looked up the prokimenon for this coming Sunday. It says, "O Lord, arouse thy strength and come to our salvation."
Yeah.
So I guess that makes sense in that context, is that you're kind of announcing.
Right. So you're calling on God to do that, and then you're reading the result.
You're reading the victory, the declaration of victory. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I remember when you first mentioned that, and it kind of woke me up. And then when I was chanting it, I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing right now.
Yeah. Really cool. So that is the spiritual warfare section of Matins.
Right.
That is
yeah. When it's read and sung, it rouses your soul at the same time, because it's that participation in the coming victory. And so, like, I don't know, that's so cool. You can't even put into words how cool that is, because you're participating by chanting that. You're participating in the victory, essentially.
Yeah. And then proclaiming to
evil,
the
like
devil, right, to his face, that Christ is risen.
Yeah, it's like in your face.
You're done. Yeah.
It's no wonder that part has always been one of my favorites. Something deep down told me it should be. So that's really cool. Anyone else have any questions for Father Stephen? We have a surprisingly quiet group today.
I guess to piggyback on that, would it be possible to think of it as like a triumph in sort of the ancient Roman sense?
Well, there's not a procession. There are elements. There are elements in a lot of our church processions of Roman triumphs. What we do on Pascha, what we do on Palm Sunday, those have more direct incorporations of those elements, including the incense. So, but even the great entrance,
like aftermath, it's definitely literally aftermath.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense then.
Yeah.
So this actually made me think of another question, because on Sunday we're always celebrating the resurrection, so that's why it's focused.
Almost always, yeah.
Yeah, it's like almost always, yeah. So it's almost like a mini Pascha every Sunday, and I've heard that described before. But like if you were to, or if someone was to have gone to like the festal orthros today for the prophet Elias, for Elijah, it's a little bit different, because I noticed like the gospel is read from the beautiful gate, not facing. Right. And is that because the focus isn't on the resurrection for that liturgy? Right. Okay.
Right. And so you don't read that we have beheld the resurrection of Christ afterward.
Right.
And there's no veneration, because what you're actually coming up and venerating is the icon of the resurrection.
Right. And
so you have the resurrection gospel that's read to the north, and then while you're hearing that we have beheld the resurrection of Christ, you come and venerate the icon of the resurrection on the gospel book.
So if it's during the week and if the focus is like for today, it would have been for the prophet Elijah. That's why there would be no gospel veneration.
Read from the door, no veneration of the book, knowing that we beheld the resurrection. Yeah.
So can you give an example of a Sunday where, because I know on some Sundays we don't venerate the gospel book.
Right. Like Palm Sunday. It's a celebration of an event in the life of Christ other than or Pentecost.
So that's the almost always part.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Unless there's another feast of Christ that falls on that Sunday.
Cool. Well, I just learned a lot about liturgics. You could tell Father Andrew he's not the only one that knows liturgics.
Okay.
No, that's
well, he's not serving every week now, so I'm sure he's totally out of practice.
Oh, he's got to be getting rusty.
Yeah. Got a lot of ring rust you got to shake off before he gets back.
Love it. All right. Any other questions before we bring this to an end? Going once? Going twice.
Question.
Ryan, you just made it. Go ahead. What is your question?
So, Father Stephen, he said that the Trinity was manifested when God is speaking with Moses, and then there's also the cloud and the angel of the Lord. I guess maybe I haven't read enough about it yet, but I kind of had the impression that most of the time when Moses or someone is speaking with God, they're speaking with Christ, because, like you said in your book, that when we talk about the word of the Lord coming to a prophet, it's not a voice in the sky, it's a person physically present, and that, God says you can't communicate with him directly. That's no one has seen the Father and so forth. So what's going on there? Does the Father sometimes speak to people directly without Christ being the mediator of that communication? Or
Well, any time there's a physical, like, visual appearance, right? But we're not told here that God appeared to Moses. There are other places where he's going to talk to God face to face. But here we're not told that he's doing that. And the comparison I was drawing to was to the voice of the Father, which was heard at Christ's baptism.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So there are times in the Old Testament when
Yeah.
someone just hears the voice of God.
Right.
Okay.
All right. We're a couple minutes after the end time, so I think we can bring this to a close. And as always, I just want to thank you, Father Stephen, for your time and for the wonderful Bible studies that you lead every single month. And we normally will confirm the next date at the end of these. So just want to check and make sure, is August 17th okay for you?
Could be.
It'll be after the Dormition, which is rapidly approaching. Great. Well, Father, I know we'll all be praying for you and all of our clergy as you travel to the National Convention next week, and I hope that's very fruitful, and pray for your safe travels to and from. So,
and our hydration as we.
And yes, it's going to be very hot.
Phoenix has been setting record temperatures the last week.
Yes. Talk about facing north and the fires, right?
Great planning. If we're gonna have the convention in the summer, let's have it in Seattle.
Yeah. Let's go north for the summer. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending. We'll look forward to seeing you on August the 17th for our next Bible study. And appreciate you being on. Have a great night, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Father. See you soon.
Thank you.